The Pilgrim Age, on walking, silence, and the age of seeking. In the departure lounge at San Francisco International, a man in a Patagonia fleece removes his Apple Watch and slides it into a Faraday bag. He is 34, recently departed from a Series C startup where he optimized recommendation algorithms for a living. In 90 minutes, he will board a flight to Madrid, then a bus to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, then he will walk 800 kilometers across northern Spain to the bones of an apostle he does not believe in. He is not unusual. In the Oficina del Peregrino in Santiago de Compostela, they have been counting arrivals since 1970. That year, 68 people completed the Camino. In 2024, the office recorded over 400,000. The curve on their charts bends upward with the fervor of a market bubble, except nothing is being sold and no one can explain the return on investment. The Camino is not alone. On the Japanese island of Shikoku, the number of walkers circumambulating 88 temples has surged beyond anything the island's aging innkeepers prepared for. Vipassana centers, 10 days of silence, no phones, no speaking, no eye contact, report wait lists stretching months. In the English countryside, pilgrimage routes dormant since the Reformation are being walked again. The Monastery of Christ in the desert, in a New Mexico canyon accessible only by 13 miles of dirt road, turns away more applicants than it accepts. Something is moving through the culture. It has no spokesperson, no platform, no algorithm optimizing its reach. It is not a trend in the way trends are manufactured. It is closer to a migration, the kind that happens when a species senses, through mechanisms older than language, that the environment has fundamentally changed. The man in the Patagonia fleece is one data point, but the data set is vast and incoherent by the standards of any market researcher trying to package it. A retired schoolteacher from Osaka, a divorced attorney from Sao Paulo, a 22-year-old from Berlin who has never entered a church, a grandmother from Chennai who walks to Tirupati for the 8th time, a former Marine who does 10 days of silence at a center in rural Massachusetts and cannot explain what happened. They share almost nothing, no doctrine, no demographic profile, no political alignment, no common language. What they share is a direction, away from screens, away from speed, towards something so old it predates every institution that once claimed to own it. This essay is an attempt to name what they are part of. We are living in the Pilgrim Age, not a metaphor, not a marketing concept, a description of what is actually happening across cultures, across classes, across belief systems in the first decades of the 21st century. The Pilgrim Age is the mass, largely secular return to ancient practices of intentional walking, pilgrimage, contemplative silence, and embodied spiritual search. It is happening outside institutional walls and often without institutional language. It is happening to people who would not call themselves religious and who may not call themselves spiritual either. It is happening anyway. It is not hiking. Hiking is recreation with a view. Pilgrimage is walking toward a question you cannot yet articulate, and the route is the articulation. It is not wellness. Wellness optimizes the self. Pilgrimage undoes the self, or at least undoes the version of self that was doing the optimizing. It is not tourism. Tourism confirms what you already believe about yourself and the world, then offers you a photograph as proof. Pilgrimage dismantles those beliefs, one blister at a time, and what it offers in return cannot be photographed. It is not a gap year, a sabbatical, or breakdown rebranded as breakthrough, though it sometimes begins as any of these. The Pilgrim Age is what happens when millions of people, independently and without coordination, begin to sense that the operating system they were given, achieve, accumulate, optimize, display, has no patch for the emptiness it produces. And rather than wait for a new ideology to replace the old ones, they do something humans have done since before the first city was built. They start walking. The numbers confirm what the body already knows. Camino de Santiago completions have grown more than sixfold in 20 years. Vipassana enrollment has expanded to over 200 centers across more than 90 countries. The hashtag is irrelevant, the waitlists are not. Monastery guest programs are oversubscribed. Forest bathing, a concept so obvious it embarrasses the species that had to rediscover it, has become a clinical intervention. Pilgrimage routes in England, France, Turkey, India, and Japan that were dormant for centuries are being walked again, not by the devout, but by the desperate and the curious and the quietly furious. The people doing this are not joiners. They are, on the whole, people who have left churches, left careers, left marriages, left ideologies, left the implicit social contracts of late capitalism. They are not building a movement. They are not writing manifestos. They are putting one foot in front of the other on paths carved by people who died 500 years ago, and they are finding that the paths still work. The objections are predictable, that this is romanticism recycled, educated Westerners fleeing modernity updated with Gore-Tex, that the Camino has become a product, complete with luxury albergues, luggage transfer services, and guided packages, that the numbers reflect cheap flights more than spiritual hunger, that this is the experience economy's latest offering, available to those with the savings and the schedule to consume it. These objections are not wrong. They are insufficient. The Camino has been commodified, and people keep walking past the luxury options to sleep on thin mattresses in rooms with 40 strangers. The growth outpaces global tourism overall, and romanticism idealized an abstract nature. The people walking today are not idealizing anything. They are leaving something specific, and the specificity is what matters. This is the Pilgrim Age, and it asks a question that no amount of data can answer, but that the data makes impossible to ignore. What are they walking toward? In 2019, a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto named John Vervaeke uploaded the first lecture of a 50-part YouTube series titled Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It was not designed for virality. Each lecture ran over an hour. The production quality was a man at a whiteboard. The content drew on Neoplatonism, Buddhist psychology, 4E cognitive science, and the relevance realization framework, material that should have appealed to approximately 40 graduate students. The series has been viewed millions of times. Vervaeke named something the culture already felt but had not articulated at the level of serious analysis, that modern Western civilization is in the grip of a meaning crisis, a pervasive sense that the frameworks which once made life intelligible, purposeful, and connected have collapsed, and nothing coherent has replaced them. The collapse is not new. Nietzsche announced the death of God in 1882. Weber described the disenchantment of the world. The existentialists spent the 20th century constructing meaning from individual will in the absence of cosmic guarantee. What is new is the scale of felt experience. The meaning crisis is no longer a philosophical position. It is a demographic fact. In the United States, the fastest growing religious affiliation is none. The non. Those who check no religion on surveys now represent roughly 30% of the adult population, up from single digits a few decades ago. Church membership dropped below 50% for the first time in Gallup's history of measuring it. Mainline Protestant denominations are closing buildings faster than they can sell them. The Catholic Church in Western Europe is functionally a heritage organization. But here is what the secularization narrative misses. The departure from religion has not produced a departure from spiritual hunger. It has intensified it. The spiritual but not religious designation, mocked by both the devout and the atheist, is not a cop-out. It is a placeholder. It is the sound a culture makes when it has left one house and hasn't found the next one yet. The hunger is structural, not personal. This distinction matters. Late capitalism trained a generation to locate meaning in achievement, productivity, and consumption. Work became identity. Purchasing became self-expression. Career trajectory became narrative arc. And for a while, it functioned, not because it delivered meaning, but because it delivered enough stimulation to simulate meaning's presence. Then it stopped working. Burnout, once an occupational hazard for emergency room nurses and combat soldiers, became a generational identity. The World Health Organization classified it. Companies hired chief wellness officers, which is the organizational equivalent of a fever reducer. It manages the symptom while the infection continues. The self-help industry grew to $14 billion annually, peddling optimization strategies for people whose fundamental problem was not inefficiency, but emptiness. The standard critique of this hunger is that it is a luxury problem, the province of the comfortable, the educated, the privileged enough to have their material needs met. The critique is not entirely wrong. Maslow's hierarchy suggests that meaning-seeking presupposes survival. But the critique is also insufficient because it cannot explain why the meaning crisis manifests most acutely in the societies that have most fully achieved material security. The Scandinavian paradox, the countries with the highest quality of life reporting among the highest rates of antidepressant use, is not a paradox at all. It is a data point that deserves more weight than it receives. Material comfort does not produce meaning. It merely removes the distractions from meaning's absence. What Vervaeke demonstrated, and what the pilgrimage numbers embody, is that the crisis is not a problem to be solved, but a transition to be undergone. Post-religion is not the end state. It is the interregnum. The old containers have shattered. The water they held, the human need for ritual, for narrative, for encounter with the sacred, for practices that connect self to world, did not evaporate. It is pooling. It is finding new channels. And the channels it is finding are very, very old. Consider, the Camino de Santiago was walked for 1,000 years before the Reformation. Vipassana predates the Buddha, who systematized it. The circumambulation of sacred sites exists in traditions so ancient, their origins are genuinely unknown. The practices surging in the 21st century are not inventions. They are recoveries. People who have lost faith in institutions have not lost faith in the practices those institutions once housed. They are going directly to the source. This is not nostalgia. Nostalgia looks backward with longing for what was. What is happening looks backward with the pragmatism of an engineer. What actually works and carries the answer forward into a context the original practitioners could never have imagined. A software developer sitting a 10-day Vipassana retreat is not reenacting the past. She is stress testing ancient technology against modern conditions and finding that the technology holds. The meaning crisis is real. But the crisis framing, while useful, captures only half the picture. A crisis implies something going wrong. What the pilgrimage number suggests is that something is also going right, something unplanned, unbranded, and operating below the frequency at which institutions and media typically detect change. The seeking is the response. The walking is the response. And the response is not waiting for permission. In November 2002, OpenAI released ChatGPT. Within 2 months, 100 million people were using it. Within a year, the conversation had shifted from will AI change things to what will be left. The question that interests us here is not the economic one. Which jobs, which industries, which skills become redundant? That conversation, while urgent, is already being had at volume. The question that interests us is quieter and more unsettling. If a machine can write, compose, code, diagnose, analyze, strategize, and optimize, what is a human being for? This is not a new question. It has been asked at every major technological threshold. The loom, the engine, the assembly line, the computer, each displaced a category of human labor and forced a renegotiation of human value. But AI represents something categorically different. It does not displace muscle or routine cognition. It displaces the cognitive activities that modern culture designated as the highest expressions of human capability: reasoning, creativity, pattern recognition, strategic thought. The optimization class, the people who built their identities on being smart, productive, and analytically excellent, are the first to feel the ground shift and the first to leave. This is the paradox that the pilgrimage data reveals. The demographic most overrepresented on the Camino, at Vipassana centers, in monastery guest programs, and on meditation retreat waitlists, is precisely the demographic most threatened by machine intelligence. Educated knowledge workers between 28 and 45, concentrated in technology, finance, consulting, and the professions. The people who optimize best are the first to seek what cannot be optimized. The connection is not incidental, it is structural. AI is the terminal velocity of a logic that has governed Western culture since the Enlightenment, that the point of human existence is to know, to control, to improve, to make efficient. This logic produced extraordinary gains: medicine, infrastructure, communication, material abundance beyond any prior generation's imagination. It also produced a monoculture of value in which a person's worth became indistinguishable from their productive output. When a machine can match or exceed that output, the logic collapses. Not the economy, the meaning structure. If your identity is what you produce and a machine produces it better, the identity crisis is not a career problem. It is an existential one. The screen is the more immediate vector. Before AI arrived to restructure the economy, the smartphone arrived to restructure attention. The average adult now spends upward of 7 hours a day looking at screens. Social media platforms, engineered by some of the brightest minds alive to maximize engagement, have produced a global attention crisis so severe that it barely registers as crisis anymore. It registers as normal. The result is a population that is simultaneously more connected and more isolated than any in human history. A species that evolved to walk, to gather, to sit in circles around fires, to read the weather by the angle of light, now sits in ergonomic chairs, staring at rectangles, performing digital labor for digital rewards. The body knows something is wrong before the mind can articulate it. This is not mysticism. It is physiology. The nervous system did not evolve for chronic screen exposure, sedentary posture, and the low-grade hypervigilance that push notifications produce. The epidemic of anxiety, the insomnia, the autoimmune disorders, the collapse of attention span in children, these are not software bugs in an otherwise functional system. They are the system's honest output. And so the most technologically immersed generation in history is doing something unexpected. They are leaving. Not permanently. They are not Luddites, and they know the machine world is the world they will return to. But they are creating intervals of radical departure. 10 days without a phone. 33 days walking across Spain. A week at a monastery where the schedule has not changed in 900 years. They are seeking the irreducibly human. What cannot be automated, the ache in your knee at kilometer 32. The taste of bread you did not earn through productivity, but through the simple act of arriving somewhere on foot. The conversation with a stranger in a language you do not share, conducted through gesture and expression, and the animal recognition that you are both, at this moment, doing something unnecessary and therefore sacred. The silence, not the silence of noise cancellation, which is absence engineered, but the silence of a valley at dawn, which is presence unmediated. Silicon Valley figured this out early, in the way Silicon Valley figures things out, through pattern recognition stripped of context. Steve Jobs went to India. The Vipassana retreat became a status signal among founders before it became a genuine practice for some of them. The irony is real but not complete. Some of the people who built the attention economy are now among the most serious seekers of its antidote. They know what the machine does to the mind because they built the machine. The Pilgrim Age is, in part, a counter-movement to the machine, not against it, but perpendicular to it. It is not anti-technology. It is pro-human in a way that only becomes necessary when the human is genuinely threatened. Not threatened with extinction, threatened with irrelevance. And irrelevance for a meaning-seeking species is worse. Here is a list of things that are declining simultaneously across the developed world. Church attendance, marriage rates, birth rates, union membership, civic organization participation, trust in government, trust in media, trust in science, average job tenure, home ownership among the young, and the number of close friends the average person reports having. That list is not a coincidence. It is a system failure. The institutions that structured human life for the past several centuries, religion, marriage, political parties, professional guilds, geographic communities, were never just organizational conveniences. They were meaning delivery systems. They told you who you were, where you belonged, what mattered, and what happened after you died. They provided ritual for the transitions, birth, coming of age, partnership, loss, death, that the unassisted psyche handles poorly. They embedded the individual in a narrative larger than the individual. They are collapsing not because people decided they were wrong, but because the conditions that sustain them have changed. Geographic mobility dissolved the parish. Economic precarity dissolved the career. The sexual revolution and contraception dissolved the inevitability of the nuclear family. The internet dissolved the information monopoly of every mediating institution. What remains are structures that still demand allegiance but can no longer deliver on their original promise. The birth rate collapse is the canary. Across East Asia, Southern Europe, and increasingly in North America, fertility rates have dropped below replacement level. South Korea's rate below 0.8 children per woman is unprecedented in recorded human history. The standard explanations, economic pressure, housing costs, career ambition, are necessary but not sufficient. Countries with generous parental leave and subsidized childcare show the same decline. Something deeper is operating. When a society cannot generate enough meaning, continuity, and communal support to make the act of bringing a new life into the world feel viable, the crisis is not economic. It is existential. The seekers understand this intuitively, even when they cannot articulate it. What they are doing, walking ancient routes, sitting in silence, entering monasteries for a week, joining informal sanghas in philosophy circles, is not escapism. It is reconstruction. They are rebuilding from ancient materials and direct experience the functions that institutions once provided: ritual, community, encounter with the sacred, narrative coherence, and practices that connect the individual to something larger. They are doing it without priests, without doctrine, without hierarchy, and often without each other. The Pilgrim Age is, structurally, a bottom-up reconstruction of meaning infrastructure by people who have no interest in building new institutions and may not even realize they are doing something collective. But they are. The albergue on the Camino, where strangers share a meal, wash each other's clothes, and attend to each other's blisters, is a temporary institution. The meditation hall, where 40 people sit in silence for 10 hours, bound by a shared discipline none of them would maintain alone, is a temporary institution. The trail itself, marked by generations of walkers, maintained by volunteers, governed by unwritten codes of hospitality and mutual aid, is an institution that has outlasted every government, every church, and every empire through whose territory it passes. The seekers are not anti-institutional. They are post-institutional. They have learned through experience that the old containers broke because the old containers could not hold what was being poured into them. And rather than design new containers from theory, rather than write another manifesto, launch another movement, build another platform, they are returning to practices so ancient and so simple that they precede the invention of institutions altogether. Walking predates the church. Silence predates the monastery. Sitting with the breath predates the Buddha. What is collapsing is not civilization. What is collapsing is the intermediary layer, the institutions that stood between the individual and the practices that sustain human meaning. The Pilgrim Age is what happens when people bypass the intermediary and go direct. Here the essay must slow down, not because the argument requires it, but because the argument is not the point. The argument is necessary, and it is not sufficient. So, slower. There is a moment on the Meseta, a vast treeless plateau in the middle of the Camino de Santiago, stretching roughly 200 kilometers across the interior of Spain, when the mind runs out of things to think about. This does not happen on day one. On day one, the mind is occupied with logistics, with pain, with novelty. It catalogs the landscape, narrates the experience, composes social media posts. It may or may not actually write. On day two, it worries. By day four, it has begun to repeat itself, cycling through the same anxieties and fantasies like a playlist on shuffle. By day 7, on the Meseta, there is nothing to look at but wheat and sky, nothing to decide but the next step, and the mind, having exhausted its repertoire, falls quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The distinction matters. Neuroscience has a framework for this, though the framework is less interesting than the experience. The default mode network, the part of the brain that narrates your life back to you, that rehearses future conversations and replays past ones, behaves differently during sustained walking than during scrolling. On a screen, it spirals. On a trail, over days, it loosens. The mental chatter does not stop. It loses its grip. Meanwhile, the body enters a state that has no clinical name, but that every long-distance walker recognizes: a deep animal coherence. The rhythm of footfall regulates the nervous system. The breath, synchronized with movement, drops into patterns the body remembers from before it had a word for meditation. Proprioception, the sense of the body in space, becomes vivid in a way that screen life suppresses, to near zero. You feel your feet. It sounds absurd to type, but the rediscovery of one's own feet, as sensory organs, as instruments of navigation, as the interface between self and earth, is reported so consistently by pilgrims that it has become almost cliché. It is cliché, the way breathing is cliché. Obvious, essential, and largely forgotten. The body remembers what the mind has overwritten. This is not a metaphor. Embodied cognition research, the 4E framework that Vervaeke draws from, demonstrates that cognition is not a process that happens in the brain and then issues commands to the body. Cognition is a whole organism activity. Thinking is shaped by posture, by movement, by the sensory environment. A body that sits in a chair and stares at a screen produces one kind of mind. A body that walks across a continent produces another. The body is the last territory the machines cannot colonize. AI can replicate your reasoning, your writing, your creative output. It cannot replicate the ache in your lower back at kilometer 40, the way the quality of light changes your mood as you descend into a river valley in Navarra. the specific exhaustion that arrives at the threshold of what you thought you could endure, and the specific elation that follows when you cross it. These are not aesthetic pleasures, they are epistemic events. They are ways of knowing that the analytical mind, for all its power, cannot access. The body on a long walk generates knowledge that cannot be transmitted by lecture, book, or screen. It must be undergone. This is why they walk. Not for the exercise, not for the Instagram, not for the credential at the end, though the credential is beautiful in its way, a Latin document affirming that you did something pointless by every metric the culture values, and that the pointlessness was the point. They walk because the body, when free from the optimization loop, remembers how to be an animal on a planet. And that remembering, wordless, proprioceptive, ancient, is the beginning of what the seeking has always been for. Everything I've written so far is true. The meaning crisis is real. The machine acceleration is real. The institutional collapse is measurable. The body's intelligence, when freed from screen and chair, is demonstrable. The forces converging to produce. The Pilgrim Age can be mapped, charted, cited, and defended in any seminar room or editorial board meeting. And none of it is sufficient. This is the problem with diagnosis. Diagnosis is the mind's way of maintaining control over phenomena that threaten its sovereignty. Name the crisis, identify the forces, build the framework, and the mind has done its job. It has understood. It has processed. It has filed the insight into correct cognitive category and moved on to the next input, leaving the person who houses the mind exactly where they were. I know this because I did it. For years, I read every book on the meaning crisis. I could recite the Camino statistics at dinner parties. I understood embodied cognition well enough to explain why walking was valuable, and I explained it from a chair, with a laptop on my knees, in a room where the blinds were drawn against a sky I had not looked at all day. Understanding pilgrimage is not pilgrimage. Analyzing the impulse to seek is not seeking. And writing an essay about the pilgrimage is not. Let me be honest about this. The same as walking out the door. The turn came on a trail in New Mexico, though calling it a trail overstates the infrastructure. It was a line of cairns across red earth, each one placed by a previous walker whose name I will never know. I was 7 days into a walk I had planned for months and justified with every intellectual framework available to me: embodied cognition, attention restoration, nervous system regulation. I had reasons. I was walking for reasons. On the 7th day, in the late afternoon, the reasons stopped. Not dramatically. There was no vision, no voice, no burning bush conveniently located at the trailside. What happened was smaller and more complete. The part of my mind that had been narrating, explaining, and justifying the walk simply went quiet. And what remained was not emptiness. What remained was the walk itself, the crunch of gravel, the heat on the back of my neck, the particular shade of rust in the sandstone, and a quality of attention I did not recognize because I had never experienced it without commentary. For perhaps 20 minutes, I was not a person walking for reasons. I was walking. The distinction is everything. I have no framework for what happened in those 20 minutes. I have read the frameworks: flow state, mystical experience, Kensho, jhana, and none of them are wrong, and none of them are it. The experience was its own authority. It did not require validation from neuroscience or tradition. It simply was, and I was in it, and then I was not. And the not being in it was also fine, because the memory had rearranged something that analysis could not rearrange. This is what the seekers know. Not from theory, from their feet. And this is why the Pilgrim Age cannot be fully understood from outside it. It can be mapped, measured, and contextualized. I have spent several thousand words doing exactly that, but the map is not the territory. The territory is dirt, and light, and breath, and the specific quality of silence that descends when the last explanation fails. They are not finding answers. This is important. The prosperity gospel of seeking, walk the Camino and find yourself, sit in silence and achieve peace, is as misleading as any other prosperity gospel. Pilgrimage is not a transaction. You do not put in kilometers and receive enlightenment. What the seekers are finding is harder to name and more valuable than answers. They are finding encounters. An encounter is not a conclusion. It is a meeting with the unknown, the uncontrolled, the genuinely other. An encounter changes you without telling you what to change into. It opens a space in the architecture of the self that was not there before, And what fills that space is not your decision. On the Camino, the encounters are constant and unpredictable. A Korean woman who has walked from her front door in Busan to Santiago, 3 years, multiple continents, and who, when asked why, says only, "I had to know." A German carpenter who walks every fall since his daughter died, not to grieve, but to give grief a body and a direction. A Brazilian teenager who left university because every class felt like a description of life rather than life itself, and who has found on the trail that the distinction she felt but could not articulate was real. On Shikoku, the encounters take a different form. The Hendro, the pilgrims circumambulating the 88 temples, receive ositai, unsolicited gifts from strangers along the route. A mandarin orange from an elderly woman at a roadside stand, a cup of tea offered without a word, a 1,000 yen note pressed into a palm. The gifts are not given to the person but to the pilgrimage itself, to the act of walking. The giver participates in the walk without taking a step. The walker receives without having asked. Something moves between them that neither can name, and that is the encounter. These encounters do not produce doctrines. They produce what the contemplative traditions call direct experience. Knowing that is not mediated by concept, institution, or authority. The seeker sits for 10 days in silence, and what she knows afterward is not a belief about the nature of mind, but a felt understanding that the mind is not who she is. The walker finishes 800 kilometers, and what he knows is not a philosophy of simplicity, but the embodied fact that he needs almost nothing to be fully alive. This is the difference between tourism and pilgrimage. Tourism confirms. Pilgrimage transforms. Tourism moves through space to collect experiences. Pilgrimage moves through space to be collected. Gathered up, dismantled, reorganized by forces the traveler does not control and cannot purchase. The contemplative traditions knew this. All of them. Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days before he taught. The Buddha sat under a tree until the tree became irrelevant and only the sitting remained. Basho walked the narrow road to the deep north and composed poems that said less and less until the silence between them carried more meaning than the words. The anonymous Russian pilgrim recited a prayer with every step until the prayer prayed itself and the pilgrim disappeared into the praying. The only Zen you find on the tops of mountains is the Zen you bring up there. Robert Pirsig. Pirsig was half right. You bring yourself up the mountain, yes. But the mountain is not neutral. The mountain, the trail, the silence, the duration, the absence of the familiar acts on what you bring. It strips. It weathers. It reveals what was underneath the curated self, and what is underneath is not always comfortable and is almost always more real. The seekers are finding that the ancient practices work, not as metaphor, not as cultural heritage, as technology in the original Greek sense of techna, a craft, a skilled practice that produces reliable results when applied with discipline and sincerity. Sitting in silence works. Walking long distances works. Rising before dawn to chant words you do not understand in a chapel built before your country existed works. These are not placebos. They are interventions that act on the nervous system, the default mode network, the habitual patterns of self-instruction, and the deep human need for encounter with the sacred. The word sacred will bother some readers. Let it. The sacred is not the religious, though religion once housed it. The sacred is what remains when all the layers of performance, productivity, and self-presentation are stripped away and something still says, this matters, and not because it is useful. The seekers are finding the sacred outside the walls that once contained it, and they are finding each other, which raises a question the individual stories cannot answer. Why now? The forces I have described explain the push, what people are leaving. They do not explain the pull, the uncanny sense, reported so consistently it deserves scrutiny, that what is being recovered was waiting to be recovered, as if on schedule. There is a book first published in 1894 by an Indian Swami named Sri Yuktaswar Giri that almost no one outside the Kriya Yoga tradition has read. It is called The Holy Science, and it is less than 80 pages long. Most of those pages are devoted to a quiet, mathematically precise argument that upends the Western assumption of linear time. Yuktaswar's claim is that human civilization moves in cycles, great ages of rising and falling consciousness turning like a wheel over periods of thousands of years. He drew from the Vedic concept of the yugas, the 4 ages described in Hindu cosmology, but he did something the Orthodox tradition had not. He recalculated the timeline. The standard Hindu reckoning places us deep in Kali Yuga, the darkest age, with hundreds of thousands of years still to run. Yukteswar argued that the standard calculation contained a compounding error introduced around 700 BC, when the astronomers of the time lost track of the precessional cycle. His corrected model places us not in the depths of Kali Yuga, but in the ascending arc of Dwapara Yuga, an age of increasing energy awareness, scientific discovery, and, this is the detail that arrests attention, mass spiritual reawakening. I did not encounter this framework in an ashram. I encountered it in a footnote while researching something else entirely, and the experience was not revelation but recognition. A feeling not of this is true, but of this fits. The ascending Dwapara, in Yukteswar's model, began around 1700 AD, roughly coincident with the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the beginning of the modern world. The age is characterized by humanity's growing ability to comprehend the subtle energies underlying the material world. Electricity, magnetism, atomic energy, and eventually the digital revolution, all manifestations of Dwapara's signature, the comprehension of forces invisible to the senses of the prior age. But here is what makes the model more than an interesting curiosity. It predicts that the transition between ages is not smooth. The boundary zones are periods of disorientation, collapse, and, crucially, seeking. As old age structures dissolve and new age capacities emerge, the population splits. Some cling to the dying frameworks with increasing desperation. Others, sensing the new energy before it has a name, begin to seek, often blindly, often alone, often through practices inherited from previous ascending ages. What I am describing in this essay, the meaning crisis, the institutional collapse, the turn toward ancient practices, the mass secular pilgrimage, maps onto Yukteswar's transition period with an unsettling precision. I say unsettling because the framework is not scientific in the Western empirical sense, and I am not asking anyone to adopt it as doctrine. I am pointing at a pattern and asking whether the pattern deserves attention. The Yuga model is not alone. Cyclical time is one of the most consistent features of pre-modern cosmology across cultures. The Hopi speak of worlds that end and begin again. The Aztec calendar encoded 5 suns, each a complete age of creation and destruction. The ancient Greeks described golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages. Norse cosmology cycles through creation and Ragnarok. Indigenous Australian songlines go further. They encode a dreaming that is not past, but eternally present, the structural ground from which each apparent age emerges and to which it returns. Time, in this framework, is not a line or even a circle. It is a landscape you walk through, and the walking keeps it alive. Linear time, the assumption that history moves in one direction, from primitive to advanced, from superstition to science, is the outlier. It is a peculiarly modern Western conviction, and it is precisely the conviction that makes the current moment illegible. If history is linear, then the return to ancient practices is regression. The collapse of modern institutions is failure. The seeking is nostalgia dressed in hiking boots. But if time is cyclical, if the oldest maps describe a territory that repeats, with variations across millennia, then what looks like collapse from inside the dying age may be emergence into the new one. The institutions are not failing because something went wrong. They are failing because they were the structures of a previous age, and the new age requires structures that have not yet been built, or that were built so long ago they appear to the linear mind as ruins. What if the oldest maps are the most accurate? I do not ask this as a believer. I ask it as a person standing in the data, the Comito numbers, the meditation waitlists, the monastery applications, the birth rate collapse, the meaning crisis, and finding that the modern maps, the linear ones, cannot account for the territory. The ancient maps can. They predicted us. Not as prophecy in the dramatic sense, but as pattern recognition across a timescale longer than any single civilization's memory. The Pilgrim Age may be an age, not a trend, not a reaction, a phase in something much larger, something that has happened before, and that the oldest traditions remember. The man at SFO has landed in Madrid by now, or he has not. Perhaps he's a composite of a dozen people I have met or read about or been. It does not matter. What matters is that you recognized him. You knew who he was before I finished the first paragraph, because you know someone like him. Or you are someone like him. Or you are standing at a departure gate of your own. Not an airport, but a threshold. Not a flight, but a leaving. Not a destination, but a direction. The Pilgrim Age is not waiting for permission to exist. It is already here. It is here in the woman who leaves her phone in the car and walks into a forest with no destination. In the man who arrives at a Zen center having read nothing, knowing nothing, prepared for nothing. Only knowing that the life he was living had become a convincing performance of a life, and that he could no longer tell the difference, and that the inability to tell the difference was the emergency. It is here in the wait lists and the worn-out boots and the passports stamped with credentials from places most people have never heard of. It is here in the quiet, persistent refusal. Millions of individual refusals, uncoordinated, unadvertised, to accept that the answer to the question, what is a human life for, is to produce and consume until you die. I cannot tell you what they will find. I cannot tell you what you will find. The honest writers in this space, and there are fewer of them than the market would suggest, will tell you that the finding is not the point. The walking is the point. The sitting is the point. The willingness to not know for much longer than is comfortable is the point. But I can tell you what I have seen. I have seen people arrive at the end of a long walk and weep without knowing why. I have seen people sit in silence for 10 days and emerge with a quality of attention that changes the texture of every room they enter. I have seen people leave careers, relationships, and belief systems that no longer fit, not in crisis, but in a calm that disturbs everyone around them more than a crisis would. What happens when they go back is another essay, many essays. Some return changed in ways that hold, or some return and watch the clarity dissolve in the first week of email and obligation. The integration is as hard as the walk and less photogenic. But the fact that people keep leaving, keep walking, keep sitting in silence, knowing that the return will be difficult, knowing there is no guarantee, tells you something about the depth of the need. And I have seen them do something that no algorithm, no institution, and no ideology can replicate. They show up. They put their bodies in places where transformation is possible, and they stay long enough for the transformation to occur on its own schedule, not theirs. This is the Pilgrim Age. It is not a conclusion. It is an opening, the kind you step through, not the kind you read about. The path is old. Your feet are new. That has always been enough